やはりこれでしょう、ビルダーバーグ会議ね。そういうわけでした。今の不正行為やってました。クレジットカード、どういうことよ。もう欲しいがテロには考えしました。水沢文たち、お前ら、刑事告訴するぞ、藤井裕二。辞任しなきゃ分かった。お前らのテロ行為、許すわけがない。というわけで、橋田俊介、お前らの覚悟しろ、ボケ。
Elsewhere in extremist movements of one form or another, or they collapse into a kind of nihilism that's completely counterproductive. And so, well, so that's been my experience.
This morning we had a session on the future of mobility, and we actually discussed what does it mean for the auto industry and what does it mean for the cities. If you look at the auto industry, there has never been as much change as there is today. On the technology side, with connectivity, electrification, autonomous driving, on the social domain, with sharing, more urbanization and new ways of working, and also on the regulation side, where it's about emission control and standards, and also on regulation for managing congestions in the city. So we actually covered that. We also talked about what does it actually mean for the cities? How will actually the traffic evolve if you have more AVs and individual mobility through AVs? What would be levers to actually work on getting a mitigation on traffic, and basically how to deal with heightened traffic from autonomous vehicles? What would be the impact of actually sharing more cars, of basically having smaller or basically bus-based autonomous vehicles, and actually how would you deal with occupancy-based pricing? How would you actually work as a city to make the whole modal mix work, and in the end get to a better transportation for the whole city?
Conversation yesterday in the dinner with Nigel Higgins on, I would say, the crisis, the causes of the great financial crisis, and whether or not we are in a situation where we could expect new major difficulty, taking into account what we have done since the crisis that erupted in 2007-2008. I have to say that the questions which were asked by Nigel were very, very stimulating. I could embark on explaining that, in my opinion, it was very much a multi-dimensional causes that we had to cope with. We had certainly the over-indebtedness that had accumulated from year 2000 up to 2007-2008, approximately 25% of the global GDP as an additional public and private debt outstanding. That was a major cause. Another cause was the new emerging properties of the new global finance system with the impact of technology, new IT technologies, and globalization. And amongst the properties, the emerging properties that I could witness myself when I was president of the ECB in 07, 08, 09, 10, 11, was that the contagion was taking place extraordinarily rapidly. You know, in the old times, you would expect that a major shock here would be transmitted to the rest of the world as a matter of months or even quarters. In the new world in which we are, it's a matter of half days. And we could experience that in 08 dramatically, obviously, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And we have other causes that are also important because, as I said, it's multidimensional. But I stress that the two causes that I mentioned just now, namely these emerging properties and the rapidity of contagion on the one hand, and the debt overburdening the global economy are still there. And we, particularly as regards the level of the debt outstanding, public and private, as a proportion of global GDP, we continue to have a piling up of debt more or less at the same pace after the crisis as before the crisis. And this is worrying, and it calls for extreme vigilance, obviously, and hard work to complete all what we have done and should do, again, to prevent the new crisis, and if we have new shocks that are very difficult to predict, to prove resilience in the new environment which we will have to accept because we have a recession in the US and in Europe, or because we have geostrategic events that would be very, very shocking at the global level, or for any other reason. That's what we discussed.
Strategic mission for Europe has to care on the globalized world. That means to stabilize our neighborship, to stabilize Africa together with others, but Africa is one of the major challenges for Europe as well. And of course, to make our European values as attractive as possible in the global competition, which order is the better one.
Some people wonder why best practices in government haven't spread faster amongst the democracies. When you see, for example, that New Zealand has solved the problem of public finance, why doesn't everybody copy it? Why doesn't everybody copy the way that the South Koreans teach their kids mathematics? Why doesn't everybody copy the way the Swiss decentralize their politics? And I think part of the answer is that we don't really spend nearly enough time looking at what is best practice. I live in the United States, though I grew up in the United Kingdom. One hardly ever hears a reference to other countries' systems in the US debate on healthcare, except when somebody is making a completely caricatured analysis of the way, say, Canada does things. So I think part of what we need to do is stress the need to look at best practice so that politicians and voters become more aware that there are solutions to most of the public policy problems. We just haven't tried them in many countries. On the other hand, I think there's one other side to this that one shouldn't forget. Sometimes you'll meet people who'll tell you, well, the Scandinavians have worked everything out, and Sweden or Finland or Denmark has come up with the perfect solution to policy problems. That's often an argument people make on the left in the United States. But I don't think the solutions that the Swedes came up with in recent decades necessarily would work in a country as large and as diverse as the United States. So let's look at best practice, let's understand which systems deliver the best results, but let's not pretend that one size is going to fit all. Part of the reason for the success of Western civilization, which is where democracy began, was the diversity of systems and the competition between them.
I recently read that information is now the world's most consequential and contested geopolitical resource. I think that's right. Global internet penetration has revolutionized the information domain, and information operations, which aren't new, are dramatically expanding in scale and scope. This is a new challenge for media organizations, which are already facing a business model crisis and declining trust. Meanwhile, AI advances confer strategic advantage to those with access to lots of data. This has implications for privacy, but also for the information advantage that democracies have traditionally enjoyed.
Well, does European diplomacy exist? It's not an easy question, and the answer is yes and no. Yes, in an institutional sense, that is, Mrs. Mogherini today exists, she travels, she can deliver some messages for Europe, but I would say certainly not on the most fundamental issues of foreign policy, because the members of the European Union are, many of them, very old nation states. They have their own foreign policy, defense, security apparatus, and so forth and so on. And I cannot imagine the French diplomacy just to be second to the European diplomacy, and the same with the UK, as long as the UK is in the EU, or the German diplomacy, and I could continue the list. So, in my judgment, the best merit of the EU diplomacy is first to perhaps reduce as much as possible the differences between the various diplomacies of the member states. And this, as such, is not so bad. And also, I think the EU diplomacy can deal with some relatively secondary issues, such as, for instance, I think of the Timor case in Indonesia, that is issues which are not at the forefront of national diplomacies, but which nevertheless can have some importance. So, to conclude, I would say that the real European diplomacy will exist only the day when the Europeans have a clear understanding of what they want to achieve, what is the identity of the European Union to be built, because diplomacy, like defense, has to do with protecting the identity of a political unit. And I think we have not yet reached the stage when we are able to answer this question: what is our identity, and what is it exactly that we want to protect?
They're certainly similar in one respect that Thucydides wrote about brilliantly in his book on the Peloponnesian War. And when a rising power, as Thucydides wrote about Athens, threatens to displace a ruling power like Sparta, or in the current situation, a rising China